Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, playing some World of Warships Legends on the PlayStation 5. Today we'll be looking at another premium ship, this time the Tier 6 German light cruiser Weimar. For this review, I'll start with some history, move into analysis, discuss commanders, run down the stats with you, and then we'll finish off with some gameplay. If you do want to skip any part of this though, please see the time codes in the description. The history of this should be fairly short, which is something I often say, and as the really short story is that the world never really got all that close to seeing something like the Weimar in reality. Following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles placed large constraints on the German Navy in terms of its overall size and what it was allowed to build. Contrary to perhaps popular perception, Germany wasn't left with no navy at all, it had been left with a navy that just couldn't do much. Among the assets that Germany did have were 8 aging pre-dreadnought battleships of the Deutschland and Braunschweig classes, 2 of which were to be kept in reserve. For comparison with ships that we have in-game, these were all considerably less advanced than the Nassau, and all of these ships were rendered obsolete by the creation of HMS Dreadnought and the naval arms race that followed. The German Navy, now reorganized into the Reichsmarine as of March 31st, 1921, was allowed to replace battleships that were 20 years or older with ships weighing as much as 10,000 tons, functionally half of the weight of a conventional battleship at the time. Several designs were drawn up, ranging from several ships that you might call more traditional, modern coastal defense battleships with guns up to 15 inches and heavier armor, to what would have been seen at that point as a fairly conventional heavy cruiser. Keep in mind this is around the time that the United States was laying down ships like the Pensacola's. Somewhere in the middle of this was originally a series of designs for 12-inch battle cruisers. Surprisingly, not much is written of this early part of the design process, with half a dozen books that I poked through picking up pretty much when these designs started to really solidify. That's surprising because I'm pretty sure I could tell you the best way to cook Bratkartoffeln in a Stahlhelm on a Panzer IV's engine block if given enough time, but it appears this design process initially leaned towards slow, well-armored coastal defense battleships, and then when the Reichsmarine came under the leadership of Admiral Hans Zenker after May 1925, the designs quickly started to solidify around a battlecruiser concept with 11-inch guns. Where this concerns us is the design of Entwurf, or Design 110, is essentially what the York is based off of in the game. This design was intended to have 8 21-centimeter guns with a cruising speed of 32 knots, and while a traditional heavy cruiser seems to have been the least popular of the design options, that is what is relatively faithfully rendered in World of Warships as the York. Where the Weimar fits into this from a game design point of view is pretty simple. German ships with 150mm guns are pretty popular. So what if you just put a whole bunch of them on this Design 110 hull? Under what set of circumstances the Reichsmarine would build a light cruiser to replace a battleship? Probably none. Wargaming's description seems to say that this was rearmed with 150mm guns. It's not unheard of that a ship might get a new main battery. Usually it isn't of smaller guns, but it certainly happens. But your guess is as good as mine, and I would say this is a creative writing assignment for those of you who want down in the comments section. The Weimar itself is named for the city of Weimar, and perhaps in connection with the common name of the German Republic that came between the German Empire and the Third Reich. As far as the ships that were intended to replace the aging battleships, none of them were initially to be named Weimar. A lot has been made about the Weimar by just about everybody who plays the game by now, and by and large I agree with the general feel I've heard from the community. This ship has a pretty obscene damage potential, and so there's an accompanying amount of hype and criticism among generally pretty talented players and community contributors. The good points of this ship are essentially very easy to nail down, and they're entirely offensive. She has a lot of fast-firing guns that ignore most armor with HE. She sets a lot of fires, and much more quietly behind those facts, the Weimar may actually have the best main battery for AP of any ship in the game that doesn't just ignore all armor. She also comes with torpedoes, and though the ship is hardly a brawler, they provide a good deterrent for those who are interested in messing with you at the very least. The Throw on some German sonar on top of that, plus a plane, and what's not to like? I can answer that too. Generally speaking, it's speed and survivability. The Weimar will be one of the slowest ships in every game she plays, which isn't a problem if you're parked somewhere where you can fire without being seen, but it is frustrating if you're called upon to play any part of the game that isn't damage. And mixed with some unimpressive rudder shift, that pretty much guarantees you're not going to be a very dodgy boat. This isn't going to help you at all when you consider that your hull is a York at its core. The reason basically no one likes the York is because of how suddenly your game can end. It's not like being a delicate flower has a unique trait for a tier 6 cruiser, but York and Weimar are definitely competitors for being one of the most yeetable targets that ever met a set of battleship guns. What I'm trying to say is that if you struggle with the York, you're probably going to do a bit better in the Weimar just because its main battery is so much better. By and large, you don't have to aim at certain parts of the ship or worry about angling just as long as you're chucking fire the entire game. But if you struggle with the York, you'll probably struggle with the Weimar because it is every bit as easy to delete and maybe just a little bit easier, actually. Players who will do well in the York are probably going to be above average players, and the better they are, the more disgusting this ship can be. When looking at the 3 historic commanders, the one you're probably most likely to go for is Karl von Müller. I would say this is probably the safest choice overall for several reasons. For one, von Müller can increase your firing range considerably, which will generally help you in the survivability department. The further you're firing, the higher your shell arcs tend to be, which does open up bits and pieces of the map where a great deal of accuracy is not necessarily required. But if you do want, Fixated is a completely reasonable choice. It's also going to offer you improved rate of fire, and most likely also fire chance. The only downside here is that you've done nothing really to fix your survivability, and that's just as well because it's near enough unfixable, so maybe not that big of a deal. Also, his passive skill will make your ship a bit faster, which is also nice. The other cruiser commander is the life of the party himself, Gunther Lutyens. While my favorite to use on the Hipper and Prince Eugen, the brawling mentality is not so healthy in this ship, leading more often than not to a "you should see the other guy" post-mortem analysis. His abilities do lend themselves to higher potential speed and maneuverability, but your rudder is going to be a bit on the slow side even with both rudder mods equipped, and that is due mostly to your fairly unremarkable speed. You will have several advantages to improve your survivability, but in no ways does Lutyens make this a very tough ship, and the thing I probably like about him more than anything else is the indicator about how much trouble I was getting into that Ingenious provides. I believe I used Reinhard Scheer for my review of the München, and I know I still use him as my go-to commander in that ship. In spite of the several things you can compare between these two ships, though, the only thing that Scheer really helps you do with a ship like the Weimar is round off some of the rough edges of its overall performance. He does have some advantage being the only choice here with a baked-in concealment option, and the destroyer ability Unstoppable is also nice because, like Hipper and Prince Eugen, you do have a fairly vulnerable engine. Other than that, it's just a bit of speed here and there, maneuverability or fire chance, but there's nothing here that's really going to hurt you. Since the Weimar is a modified York-class ship, expect several comparisons to that as we jump into the stats. For survivability, the Weimar has 32,000 hit points, which is 600 less than the York, which itself has a hit point pool that's on the low side of average. The Weimar's armor is listed as 13 to 150 millimeters of armor. This appears to be worse than the York's, but when we look at the armor model, the only substantive difference in the armor scheme is the turrets. The front faces of the Weimars being 150 rather than 180 millimeters. I have yet to lose a turret in this thing, and trust me when I say it's considerably more likely that the rest of this ship is going to get shot out from under you before this difference in turret armor is going to be noticeable. Your ship does have a turtleback, and it does appear to be relatively decently angled with a 30mm thickness. This should give you some protection against battleship and cruiser AP shells. I found in practice, though, it very rarely does, and I have citadeled a Weimar several times with another Weimar. Finally, you do have 10% torpedo reduction, which is pretty close to average for the tier. In artillery, you have 4 turrets, each mounting 3 150mm guns. They have an impressive 5-second reload. Each shell does 1700 HE shell damage with an 8% fire chance, or a deceptively excellent 3750 AP damage. In all intents and purposes, the Weimar shares all of these characteristics with the München, except that it gets 400 extra meters of range and 4 extra guns. Though not exactly slow turrets, the Weimar's guns rotate about 20% slower than München's at 23.7 seconds, putting it very close to average for a cruiser at this tier. Thanks to your large number of guns and high rate of fire, the Weimar is very nearly the best fire starter at the tier, even before you take commander skills. You have good HE DPM, and that is even before you consider that these guns have 1/4 penetration, meaning you will penetrate just about every cruiser you face, regardless of where you hit it, except the turrets, the belt, and the always frustrating conning tower. The same is true for battleships at tier 5 and 6, though like other light cruisers, your ability to penetrate will be mostly limited to the superstructure at tier 7. If that weren't enough, the Weimar's AP shell damage may not look incredible by itself, but you should very much consider using AP when you can, because this has the highest AP damage per minute of any ship in the game. And that's not actually even by a small margin. It's something like 2000 potential damage per second, better than the next best cruiser. And even though you'll miss some of those shots or bounce, that makes you especially dangerous to cruisers at those close ranges. As a spiritual precursor to the Hipper class cruisers, the Weimar does come with the same torpedo layout as the York. This comes as a pair of triple launchers on either side with a modest 6-kilometer range. The torpedoes have a respectable 64 knot speed, and I would say they do a modest 13,700 damage. This is just like basically all other high-tier German torpedoes, but again, you do get 6 of them, and people tend to eat more than 1 of these per serving. Similar to York and other low-tier German cruisers, your survivability makes employing these as an offensive weapon fairly challenging, but when backed into a corner, they are a very potent deterrent at the very least. In the anti-aircraft department, the Weimar's 55 rating is exactly what you'd expect from the York, and actually pretty much exactly what you would expect from a tier 6 cruiser in general. It manages to do this with a very short AA suite, ranging out to just 3.5 kilometers, and putting out a paltry 115 damage. I think the hidden flak stat here is what's saving this from a truly terrible rating, as I'm fairly certain that these are not dual-purpose main battery guns. They certainly aren't listed in the München's, Königsberg, or Nürnberg's AA, for instance. But German ships do tend to put out a lot of flak bursts. In any case, the Weimar has what I would consider at best a fairly middling AA, and it is very easy for a carrier to keep you spotted without flying into your AA range. As we come to maneuverability, this is not the strong suit of the Weimar, as you have somehow lost 1 knot of maximum speed versus the York, and your rudder shift is nearly 10% slower. The only cruisers you are likely to face that are slower than you are going to be Boise, Surrey, and Graf Spee. That said, 650 meters on the turning circle is fairly tight, and the rudder shift is not exactly catastrophically bad at 8.8 seconds, but if you don't like the York's handling, the Weimar's is just a bit worse. The Weimar's base concealment is also not very good, nor is its concealment from air. This is the exact same value as on the York and Algerie, both of which are quite noticeable, with only the shores having a worse concealment at this tier. Though you do have relatively small guns for a cruiser, I think owing to the amount of firepower that you have, your sea detectability in smoke is 6.4, which is actually pretty average, and 300 meters worse than München, which happens to use a fewer number of similarly sized guns. As we go into consumables, these are the York's consumables, which means it comes with German cruiser sonar. That means exceptional 5.4 kilometer detection of ships in smoke or through islands, as well as better torpedo detection. I can't think of why you would do this, but you can swap out sonar for defensive fire AA. That won't make you a particularly good AA ship, and you'll be throwing away a big advantage, so really just don't do that. In your last slot, we have a catapult fighter, which is not really notable in any way other than this seems to have some variant of the BF-109 as a float plane that I'm pretty sure was never a thing. But my guess is if you're upset about that, you're probably a lot more upset about the ship that float plane is sitting on. Alright, so we are going to go ahead, get into some gameplay here. I'm going to be on Trap. Here you can see we've got Mark in our division. As the battle gets going, we're going to swing out towards the A side. You can see we're flying the Weimar's special flag. It is incredibly German. And of course, we'll go ahead and put our commander up on the screen. This is not what I would suggest typically using in this. I do bounce around, and depending on the result, I go ahead and use whatever I think best represents the particular ship. We're going to get some ideas of the strengths and weaknesses in this. I will note that this is a little bit later in my experience with it, so I have decided not to go with extra rudder in the third slot. We're sticking with the concealment. Everything else here is basically just going to make my life a little bit easier in the survival sense, but this is not necessarily the best build or recommended. It does still work, and you'll be able to see exactly how good this actually works just out of the box in terms of its offensive ability. Starting off early in the game, we have a couple of battleships out there. We're going to see if we can't start setting some fires there so we can maybe farm them down a little bit. Meanwhile, this Geta is going ham. And I continue to pump shots out there. And deny Mark his torpedo hit percentage, because he would have at least hit one of those. But that said, we do take the Geta out at range. At close range, the Weimar is just scary good against destroyers. Second only really to American cruisers in the amount of damage that they can farm in a very, very short period of time. Now you can see we're kind of getting behind this island in such a way that we hope to be able to lob the short part of it. The Weimar does have listed in its stats that it has the same guns as the Nuremberg. That might be the design principle, but in practice this has the same gun performance as the München, which means that it does lob shells a little bit more than the Nuremberg does, and that actually helps in this sort of situation. And this is exactly the type of gameplay that the Weimar mostly excels at. Now, with two ships out of the way, we do see that somebody's challenging B. I'm not really interested in going on an expedition to try to find that battleship because, frankly, I am just too slow to take that long of a detour. Plus, there's not a lot of cover over there. You did see with our build, we do have better than the base 31 knots, and obviously with the flag, we're going to get maybe up to 32, 33, 34 pretty easily. But that's all the faster we're going to be able to go. And since most other people are also increasing their speed, that means that we're still going to be pretty slow for a cruiser. I do follow my shells in there at the end because I'm using preset number 2, and that is an option on preset 1 and 2. Unfortunately, nobody can see the enemy Weimar, so I am starting to flank around the side. We do want to keep that California and that North Carolina and the Weimar and basically everything behind some sort of cover so that we don't get spotted and too heavily focused. Obviously, we were firing. Somebody's got a plane up in the air, and we are momentarily noticed by that. My inclination here first is to try to turn to the right, because I'm pretty sure this guy's going to turn all the way to the left. We get a little bit far out there, and even though the California is only a tier 5 battleship, if he punches me through the front of this thing, that can cause a lot of problems pretty quickly for me. And in this particular game, we're using a lot of HE so far. We switch over to AP, and this is against, obviously, a well-armored target. If we aim upper belt, we can still get a nice chunk of damage using that. You can see in both cases we got near about 4,000 damage per salvo. 4,000 damage per salvo at this range against a battleship is not bad. If he was closer, that would be more hits, probably more pens, and more damage. Enemy Weimar would be a great thing to get out of the game. So we start firing very lazy shots over that island. And now we're going to try to do the whole thing all over again with the North Carolina. This is pretty recognizable as standard kind of American style cruiser play. I would describe the Weimar as kind of the mix between like a Helena and a York. I'm very concerned about firing in open water against a North Carolina because with his improved angles, I'm not real confident that I have many places on this ship where I can actually bounce. Plus I have no luck at all facing North Carolinas. So usually I like to display all the weaknesses of a ship if possible. This one's a little bit hard to show off without getting just deleted, which I haven't had happen to me in this ship, but I had it happen to me so many times in the York that I know how this game works. I was chancing a little bit there. We get lucky. If your belt is appropriately angled, it is possible to bounce some shells. The belt is pretty low on the ship though, and pretty much everything's going to come through the 25mm upper belt and deck, particularly when it's shot by a 16-inch American battleship. Now, with that out of the way, we have managed to get A. We are in a pretty good position in terms of the overall number of ships on the team. And, of course, the only thing we really need to worry about is if they successfully run away and somehow we just run out of time. I am starting to sail towards B, but I get my guns around on the Gneisenau. See if we can't get him burning a little first. Gneisenau is very competitive with the speed of the ship, and he may actually be faster depending on what he is running. In any case, we mirror his turn so that we can head directly towards B. I don't think he's going to be able to get away, but right now we're kind of being trolled by our fire chance, and it's not helpful that I can't seem to hit anything. At a distance, we've got a pretty lengthy shell travel time. That does make it kind of annoying when having to deal with other, more agile cruisers. Battleships, usually not quite as much. We're hitting 10.5 seconds. It seems to be a little on the slow time, but we are not talking about like Flint levels of shell travel time by any stretch of the imagination. But it's not the easiest thing in the world. As the Hood enters the battle, we will go ahead and switch over to that. I know he has a lot of superstructure, and that superstructure should be pretty susceptible to HE fire. You can see each one of these volleys is getting 2,000 to 3,000 damage. If we had any sort of luck at all, I guess we would set some fires. But like all good things, all you need to do to fix it is complain about it. And now as we leisurely sail past 118,000 damage, we have picked up the high caliber, and again we have tucked ourselves in behind another island so that we can be just totally annoying. A lot of people make comparisons between this ship and the München. I think that they can be played very similarly. The München does do this if it has the opportunity. That said, I think the München has a lot more opportunity to get around the battlefield, which in my opinion makes it a more fun ship to play. I also tend to think that I survive a little bit better in the München, but the sizes of these ships are actually very similar, and their armor scheme is not different enough to make that big of a difference, so we'll just call that one luck. But in any case, you can see that we are winding down to the last few moments in the game. We'll get into, I guess, my final thoughts. So, Weimar, do I like it? It's alright. It does a lot of damage, but doing damage isn't the only thing in the game by any stretch of the imagination. Is it overpowered? Yeah, probably. Will it get nerfed? Signs point to no, but that's not impossible. I think more than likely they'll just reduce its availability. Will this ship make you a better player? No. No, it won't. And if you can't play the York, you probably won't really enjoy this ship either, except for the odd game where you just happen to get a ton of damage. Is this bit wearing thin? And only you can answer that. But I don't really have much more to say on this ship, so let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.